we need to remember that the electrons and the entanglement field and everything else is part of an entire reality. We need to keep that part in mind, he says, the fact that it's not, we can't focus in on a little teeny tiny speck. Now he talks about this instead of, get this, instead of, as the regular cosmologists and physicists today have found, things are orderly up here in the real world, but as we go down into the subatomic world they become chaotic and we don't understand what's going on. Bohm takes a different approach. He says, look at the fact that people are walking around in a crowd, let's say humans, and they all act independently, differently, as opposed to two ballerina dancers who would go around a post and come back together. And generally, things are pretty chaotic around us. Things are pretty different. Things are pretty separated. Things are pretty unrelated. And he says the further we get down into the quantum level, the more we see that things are all related, that everything is not only, or is everything real and it touches each other, that's one thing, but his point is that everything is completely connected, all together at all times, completely. So, David Bohm looks at the subatomic world and he finds a lot of order in it. He finds order and connectedness and a whole oneness compared to the chaos and individuality and stuff that goes on up in the macro world that we live in. Very different from the people who think the macro world makes sense, but we go into the subatomic world and nothing makes sense anymore. And they have all sorts. You've seen, oh, what's that, Brian Greene's movie, What the Bleep Do We Know? You know? Well, a lot less than David Bohm, I'll say. He says, I think our perception is influenced by our thinking. Now that, be it true or not, is a fresh approach. That's different from saying that reality is influenced by our perception. Okay? He says that what we perceive is influenced by what we think. And there is some evidence for that. If we think we're going to see this or that or the other, later on, even though we didn't actually see it, we think we remembered of having seen it. There are experiments showing that. So what we think sometimes determines what we see. Very different from the modern physicists who say that what we see is a creating act that makes the universe occur. Right? Our perception creates the universe. Right? That's modern quantum dogma, mysticism. But he says that our thinking about the subject might change what we perceive. Maybe that. Yeah. He talks about the Newtonian view of the world, how Newton viewed it as all one system, wherever it is, it's gravity, and how that is so different from the modern, now using Newton's holistic approach, his view of the whole situation, anything that happens in any part of the situation is determined by what happens in the rest of the whole. Okay? The rest of the whole, W-H-O-L-E. But in the atomistic view, that everything's a single atom instead of the holistic view that there's the whole universe, in the atomistic view, it isn't necessarily true that what's true of the part is true of and determined by the whole. Now, let's assume for a second the Big Bang were true. Okay? The Big Bang's true, it starts out here, expands, matter evolves. When we take this later matter apart, when we break it apart, is it necessarily going to yield all the same results going backwards as, you know, is it going to, it built up a certain way evolutionarily, assuming the Big Bang's true. And if we blow it into pieces, are those all going to act exactly the same? Now, however they act is determined by the nature of the universe as a whole, the Newtonian worldview. But is it going to give us insight into really where things came from? Is that true, that we can just break things apart with a microscope and look smaller and smaller and smaller and always have an independent truth? Or is the truth of the small part dependent on the whole reality? Which is what he's saying. He says we have to look at the whole reality. Don't forget the rest of reality, guys. Come on. Then the interviewer asks around 9 minutes, do we have to choose between these views of looking at the part or looking at the whole situation? Is it an either-or thing? And Bohm says the Newtonian idea, from the age of Newton, the idea back then was the parts are the reality. The only real thing is this and that and the other. And the whole is just an idea. It's a concept that we use when it's useful, when it's realistically useful, when it's objectively useful. So the only thing that exists are the parts, right? What is the view of quantum mechanics, though? Is that true that the whole universe as such is just a concept, right? What the actual things that exist are the parts. Objectivism actually takes that view. The little things that exist here and there and that, over here and this and that, that's the universe. And then we can think about things like the word chair doesn't exist in the universe. Concepts and stuff, floating things, different, not physical, right? The only thing that's really real is the physical, real, individual stuff. Quantum mechanics takes an absolutely opposite view of this. They say the only thing that's really real is the whole universe, right? The universe is all there. There's something there. Even if the universe is just a hologram of soccer ball, it's all there. The universe is there. But the individual parts may or may not necessarily be real or true. That's very different from saying the individual parts are true and the whole is just a concept. And they say the whole thing is definitely here, but the individual parts can be subjectively changed and determined depending on perception and so on, depending on measurement and so on. Absolutely switcheroo, opposite view from the Newtonian method. And he says at the very, very beginning of the second video of the interview, he says, as part 2 of the interview, like 9 minutes and 50 seconds or something into the interview, he says, we have our choice of either placing the whole or the parts as the fundamental reality, and which one we choose depends on what comes out of that. And he says the most basic change that quantum mechanics makes is to place the whole as fundamental instead of the parts, right? Instead of the individual parts that we all measure and perceive as being the reality, and then we figure out the whole from that, we figure out the laws and stuff. Instead of that, quantum mechanics says the whole is real, but the parts are not. And then he unfortunately interrupts this profound thought with a small digression on theories, which I will answer. He says that everyone has a theory. We can make up an infinite number of theories on everything and anything. He says an insane man has his own theories on how things are, but it's just less coherent. Mr. Cropper disagrees. I believe that a theory can only be formed as an inductive hypothesis based on facts, which have to be observations, information from the 5 senses. So, step 1, information from the 5 senses. Step 2, form a hypothesis. Step 3, there's a theory if it's elaborate enough and if there's any proof to support it. Right? It's a hypothesis until there's proof to support it. But you have to have evidence to get there to begin with. Now, saying that anybody can have a theory on anything and there's an infinite number of theories that could be made up of everything is granting a little less respect to the word theory than I think should be applied. According to Aristotle, string theory would not be a theory because it doesn't have any evidence supporting it. And any theory or any hypothesis to begin with, a hypothesis has to be based on evidence from the 5 senses. And a theory is an elaborate hypothesis that has evidence for it. So, yeah, just to put that aside, he buys into this idea from Karl Popper and stuff that any theory, anything you say could be a theory. But Aristotle said, no, you have to have evidence for it. And I'm going to jump back to Aristotle and stick with him. Now he talks very reasonably about theories. I think he says they are said to reflect reality. And he says he thinks they correspond to reality. And they don't reflect reality. I don't know why he's against that word. But what he means is it's like a road map. The road map is a piece of paper with dotted ink on it. Okay? What reflection is there on that road map of the town or whatever that the map is of? He says the real thing is that the real fact is that a theory is the abstractions that we evolve, the abstractions we come up with to explain and relate things. That's what a theory is the abstractions we come up with to explain and relate things rather than a reflection of things. We don't let the things bounce off